I thought the paperwork was just a formality, a routine visit to the notary's office with my aunt to finalize some inherited family matters. I had no idea that she had spent the previous 6 months quietly constructing a legal trap designed to strip me of the only thing my grandmother had ever left me. And the worst part, the part that still wakes me up at 3 a.m, heart hammering, breath short, was that my own cousin had helped her every step of the way, handing over documents I had never signed, dates I had never agreed to, signatures that looked disturbingly close to mine but belonged to no moment in my life that I could remember. By the time I understood the full shape of what they had planned, I was sitting in a hard plastic chair in a lawyer's office, staring at a document that claimed I had willingly transferred the ownership of my apartment to my aunt. A document dated 3 months prior, at a time when I had been on a work trip in another city, 300 kilometers away, with hotel receipts, plane tickets, and a colleague's testimony to prove it. The forgery was elegant, meticulous even, and if I had arrived at that notary's office 5 minutes later, it would have been entirely too late to stop any of it. The apartment had been my grandmother's. She had lived there for 41 years, in a building on a wide, leafy street in the older part of the city, where the ceilings were high and the radiators clanked, and the windows faced a courtyard full of linden trees that bloomed every June and filled every room with a sweetness so thick you could almost taste it. My grandmother, Valentina Ivanovna, had been a small, sturdy woman with silver hair she wore in a braid and hands roughened from decades of work, and she had loved that apartment the way some people love a person. Quietly, stubbornly, unconditionally. When she died, she left it to me. I was 28 then. I had been living in a rented room on the other side of the city, commuting 2 hours a day to the marketing firm where I worked as a project coordinator, eating cheap lunches at my desk and trying not to think too hard about how long it would take to save enough for a down payment on anything. When the notary read the will and said my name, just my name, not my mother's, not my Aunt Lyudmila's, not my cousin Dimitri's, I felt something shift inside me, a deep tectonic thing, like a door opening in a wall I had assumed was solid stone. I wept at the funeral not only from grief, but from gratitude, from the staggering, almost unbearable tenderness of knowing that my grandmother had thought of me, had chosen me, had given me the thing she loved most. My aunt did not weep at the funeral. She stood near the back of the room in a dark coat with a fur collar, her face arranged in an expression of dignified composure, and she watched the proceedings with careful, measuring eyes. Lyudmila was my mother's older sister, or rather, she had been my mother's older sister until my mother died of a heart attack when I was 19, and after that, she had become something harder to name, a presence, a relative, an obligation. She came to family dinners at New Year and brought chocolates I never liked and asked about my salary in the same tone she might ask about a used car's mileage. She had a son, Dimitri, who was 34 and worked intermittently in some vague capacity related to construction permits, and she had a husband, Uncle Gennady, who drank moderately and spoke rarely and seemed to exist primarily as a piece of furniture in their 2-room apartment across the city. After the inheritance was settled, Lyudmila called me. She said she was happy for me, that it was what grandmother would have wanted, that of course it was completely fair and right. Her voice was warm and careful, each word placed with the precision of someone navigating a minefield they had mapped themselves. She suggested we get coffee sometime, catch up, stay close as a family. I said yes, because I was 28 and I had just buried my grandmother and I was lonely, and because I genuinely, naively thought that grief might be the thing that finally made us a real family. I moved into the apartment in early September. The linden trees in the courtyard had already gone gold, and the light in the evenings was the color of old honey, slanting through the tall windows and pooling on the parquet floor in a way that made the whole space look like something out of a film. I kept my grandmother's furniture for the first year. Her round kitchen table, her dark bookshelves, her narrow single bed in the back room, and slowly, piece by piece, I made the space my own. I painted the kitchen walls a warm off-white. I bought a deep green velvet sofa that my grandmother would have considered extravagant. I hung my own photographs above the desk. I learned which radiator needed to be bled in October and which window latch stuck in damp weather, and exactly how long the hot water took to run after you turned on the shower in the morning. It was the first home I had ever truly inhabited, and I loved it with the same stubborn, unconditional love my grandmother had carried for 41 years. Lyudmila began visiting that autumn. Not often at first, once a month maybe, on a Sunday afternoon, bringing a cake from the bakery near her apartment and sitting at the round kitchen table with her coat still on for the first 20 minutes, as if she hadn't quite decided to stay. She admired the apartment in that particular way of hers, thorough, systematic, room by room, commenting on the ceiling height, the quality of the parquet, the view from the kitchen window. "This is really valuable real estate, you know," she said once, almost casually pulling a piece of cake apart with her fingers. "In this neighborhood, prices have gone up 30% in the last 2 years. You should be careful with it." I told her I intended to be careful with it. I was living in it. She smiled and changed the subject. By the following spring, the visits had become more frequent. She began bringing Dmitri along occasionally, and he would wander through the rooms while his mother and I sat in the kitchen, and I would hear his footsteps on the parquet, deliberate and unhurried, the footsteps of someone measuring. He was a broad, quiet man with his mother's eyes, watchful, calculating, and a way of standing in doorways that always made me feel, without knowing exactly why, like I was the visitor and he was the one deciding whether to let me in. He said little during these visits, but he looked at everything, and sometimes I caught him taking photographs with his phone of the windows, the walls, the view from the balcony. And when I asked what he was photographing, he said he was just curious about the architecture. I noticed things. I noticed them the way you notice a low-grade fever, not alarming enough to stop everything and deal with, but persistent, nagging, impossible to fully ignore. Lyudmila began asking about my finances with increasing regularity, framing each question as concern. Was my salary stable? Had I thought about what I would do if the company downsized? Did I have savings? Did I have a loan on the apartment? What were the monthly utility costs exactly? She asked whether I had updated the property documents since inheriting, whether I had registered the apartment in my name with the municipal housing registry, whether I had a current technical passport for the property. I answered her questions because I did not yet understand that she was not asking them out of curiosity. She was taking inventory. There was an evening in March. I remember it precisely because the heating had gone out in the building, and I was sitting at the kitchen table in my coat, eating soup and trying to warm my hands on the bowl, when Lyudmila called and asked, very gently, very carefully, whether I had ever thought about adding her name to the ownership documents. "Just as a precaution," she said, "in case something happened to you. You're living alone, you have no husband, no children. If God forbid something happened, the apartment could end up in the hands of the state. I could be listed as a secondary beneficiary. Just paperwork." I said I would think about it. I did not think about it. I put the phone down and watched the steam rise from my soup and told myself I was imagining the calculation behind her voice. I was not imagining it. The first sign that something was already in motion came from a place I did not expect. I had been at work late on a Thursday. It was the end of the fiscal quarter and we were closing reports, and I came home exhausted, carrying a bag of groceries and my laptop case and the particular weight of a day that had demanded everything and given very little back. I dropped my bags in the hallway, took off my coat, and went to check the mailbox before going upstairs, a habit so ingrained I barely registered doing it. Among the usual debris of advertisements and utility notices, there was an envelope, thick, official-looking, printed with the logo of a local legal firm I had never heard of. I opened it standing in the lobby under the harsh fluorescent light, while a neighbor's cat watched me from the third step of the staircase. The letter was brief and formally worded. It informed me that a claim had been filed regarding the inheritance of the property at my address, citing procedural irregularities in the original will. It invited me to contact the firm to discuss the matter at my earliest convenience. It was signed by someone named V.A. Morozov, Associate Attorney. I stood there for a long moment, reading the letter twice, then a third time. The cat on the stairs grew bored and disappeared. The fluorescent light buzzed above me. My grocery bag was cutting into my palm, and I realized I was gripping it so tightly my knuckles had gone white. Procedural irregularities in the original will. I folded the letter back into its envelope with fingers that were not quite steady and went upstairs, and I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, without eating, without turning on the television, without moving at all, just sitting there in the growing dark with the envelope in front of me, trying to understand what it meant and who had filed the claim and why they had waited 2.5 years after my grandmother's death to do so. I called the firm the next morning. The receptionist was pleasant and uninformative. V.A. Morozov was in a meeting. He would call me back. He did not call me back that day, or the next. On the third day, I called again and was told, with polished regret, that the matter was confidential at this stage, and that the firm represented a private client whose identity could not be disclosed until formal proceedings began. I asked whether I should retain my own legal counsel. There was a brief pause, the smallest hesitation, almost imperceptible. And then the receptionist said that I was, of course, free to do so, in a tone that suggested this would be a very reasonable thing to do. I called Lyudmila that evening. I mentioned the letter, keeping my voice neutral, casual, as if I were reporting a minor inconvenience. There was a fraction of a second, just a fraction, barely perceptible, before she responded, and in that fraction of a second, something changed in the air between us, some invisible atmospheric shift, like the pressure drop before a storm. "Oh, that's very strange," she said. "How upsetting for you. Do you want me to come over?" I said no. She said to let her know if there was anything she could do. I hung up and sat with the phone in my hand and thought about that fraction of a second, about the shape of her silence before she spoke, and I felt for the first time the specific cold weight of genuine suspicion, not anxiety, not paranoia, but the crystalline, clarifying certainty that something was wrong and that I was already behind. It took me 2 more weeks to find a lawyer of my own. Her name was Irina Sergeyevna, and she came highly recommended by a colleague whose family had gone through a property dispute the previous year. She was a compact woman in her 40s, with short hair and reading glasses she wore on a chain around her neck. And when I sat down across from her desk and laid out everything I knew, the letter, the firm, the years of Lyudmila's careful questions, the photographs Dmitri had taken, the conversation about adding her name to the documents, she listened without interrupting, writing in a small notebook in handwriting too small for me to read. When I finished, she set down her pen and looked at me over the top of her glasses. "Has anyone asked you to sign anything recently?" she asked. "Any documents, any consents, anything you may have signed without reading carefully?" I thought about it. There had been a letter the previous autumn. Something from the housing management company. Lyudmila had brought it over, said it was routine maintenance authorization, something about planned repairs to the building systems. I had signed it without reading it properly because she was standing in my kitchen and the soup was burning on the stove. The memory surfaced slowly, the way memories do when they carry something you didn't want to know. Her hands, slightly too still as I reached for the pen. The way she had folded the paper before I could look at it a second time. The fact that she had taken it with her when she left. I told Irina Sergeyevna about the letter. She nodded as if this confirmed something she had already suspected. "Do not sign anything else," she said. "Do not let anyone into the apartment without witnesses. And most importantly, do not tell your aunt that you have retained counsel. Not yet." I drove home from that meeting in the early evening, through streets gilded by the last of the spring light, and I sat for a long time in the parking lot outside my building before going in. The linden trees in the courtyard were just beginning to bud, the way they did every year, swelling with the particular green of new leaves against an old sky. I had loved those trees. I had thought of them as mine, part of the place that was mine, the only thing that was entirely and unmistakably mine. Sitting in my car in the dimming light, I understood for the first time that someone had been looking at those same trees and seeing something I had never thought to see. A calculation, a value, a target. The anger I felt in that parking lot was quiet and flat and enormous, like a landscape. It was nothing like the hot, shaking anger I had felt when I opened the letter, or the cold, sick fear I had felt in the lawyer's office. It was something much older than either of those things, something steady and permanent, bedded deep, patient as stone. I sat with it for a while. Then I went upstairs, unlocked my door, and began to plan. The discovery itself came 17 days later, and it came not through any dramatic confrontation or brilliant deduction, but through something far more mundane. A phone call from Irina Sergeyevna on a Tuesday morning while I was standing in the office kitchen waiting for the coffee machine to finish. "I need you to come in today," she said. "This afternoon, if possible. I've received the documentation from the opposing firm, and there are things you need to see in person." I left work early, telling my manager it was a medical appointment, which felt, in some oblique way, accurate. I drove across the city in the kind of flat, gray May weather that makes everything look temporary, and I sat down across from Irina Sergeyevna's desk and watched her open a folder and slide a series of documents toward me with the careful, deliberate movement of someone placing something fragile on an unstable surface. The first document was a deed of transfer. It was typed on official letterhead, stamped, notarized, and bore my name, my passport number, my registered address, and a signature that was nearly, almost precisely, mine. It was dated the 14th of February of the previous year, a Thursday, and on that Thursday I had been in the city of Kazan attending a 3-day client conference, a fact documented by airline boarding passes, a hotel registration card, expense receipts from 3 separate restaurants, and email correspondence with 6 colleagues and a client who could each confirm my presence. On the 14th of February of the previous year, I had been standing in a conference room in Kazan, eating a catered lunch and listening to a regional sales director explain projected growth targets, and I had absolutely, categorically, not been in a notary's office in my home city signing over my apartment to anyone. I looked at the signature for a long time. It was good. It was disturbingly, unnervingly good. Whoever had done it had clearly practiced, had studied my actual signature with care and patience, had understood the specific angle at which I hold a pen and the slight leftward drift of my letters and the way I dot the I in my first name. Looking at it felt like looking at a reflection of myself in water that had been disturbed, recognizable but wrong, familiar but off by something you couldn't precisely measure. "The notary who certified this document," Irina Sergeyevna said, folding her hands on the desk, "is a man named Peter Viktorovich Sokolov. He's been practicing for 19 years and has no prior disciplinary record." She paused. "He is also, according to municipal records, the brother-in-law of Dmitry Leonidovich, your cousin." The room did not spin. I had always read descriptions of that sensation in books and found them melodramatic, but I understood them in that moment. Understood what it meant when someone said the floor moved, because what I felt was precisely that, a brief, sickening sense that the solid surface I had been standing on was less solid than I'd believed. My hands, resting on the folder, were completely still. I made them stay that way. "How long?" I said. "How long has this been in preparation?" Irina Sergeyevna looked at me for a moment before she answered. "Based on what I've been able to establish so far, at least 18 months. The notarial registration was filed in February, but the groundwork, obtaining your passport details, establishing the necessary contacts, preparing the documents, that began much earlier, possibly as early as shortly after you moved in. 18 months. I had moved into the apartment in September, and within weeks, perhaps before I had even finished painting the kitchen walls, before I had learned which radiator to bleed in October, the plan had already been in motion. I thought about all the Sunday afternoon visits, all the cakes from the bakery, all the careful questions about my salary and my savings, and whether I had a loan on the apartment. I thought about Dmitry and his photographs of the windows and the walls. I thought about the document I had signed without reading, standing at my kitchen stove with soup burning on the burner. Every visit, every conversation, every apparently casual gesture had been a step in something that had been designed, planned, and executed with a patience and deliberateness that I was only now beginning to fully comprehend. "There's something else," Irina Sergeyevna said. She slid another document across the desk. "This is a rental agreement, also bearing your signature, dated 4 months after the transfer deed. It appears that once the apartment was formally transferred to your aunt's name, she intended to rent it out. She had already found a tenant. The agreement was for a term of 3 years. She paused again. The monthly rent was set at a figure roughly equivalent to your current salary. I looked at the rental agreement. It was thorough. It included a clause about the tenant's right to sublet. It included a clause about the landlord's right to inspect the premises with 48 hours' notice. It included, on the second page, a clause that would have required me, had I still been living there by some legal technicality, to vacate within 30 days of the agreement taking effect. They had thought of everything. That was what I kept coming back to in the days that followed. The sheer comprehensiveness of it, the architectural quality of the plan, the way each piece had been fitted to the next, with the care of someone who had looked at the whole structure from every angle and sealed every possible gap. They had not acted on impulse or out of sudden greed. They had spent 18 months, perhaps longer, building a machine designed to take my home, and they had done it while drinking tea at my kitchen table and bringing cakes from the bakery and asking about my health with expressions of warm, practiced concern. I did not call Lyudmila that night. I sat in my apartment, still mine, still registered in my name until the deed of transfer was contested in court, and I listened to the radiators and the sounds of the building settling around me and the distant noise of the city, and I thought with a clarity that felt almost surgical about what I was going to do. Irina Sergeyevna had already filed a formal objection to the proceedings, citing the impossibility of my physical presence at the notarization given the documented evidence of my absence. She had also contacted the Municipal Housing Registry to place a flag on any further transactions involving the property. She had recommended I do two things: gather every piece of evidence that established my presence in Kazan on the 14th of February, and say nothing to my relatives until she told me to. I gathered the evidence. I spent the following weekend assembling every document, every receipt, every email, every message that placed me in Kazan on those 3 days in February. I found the boarding passes in an email folder. I found the hotel confirmation. I found the expense report I had submitted to accounting, countersigned by my manager. I found 8 separate photographs from the conference, posted to our company's internal network, in which I appeared with a timestamp and a location tag and the unmistakable backdrop of a Kazan conference center. I put it all in a folder and delivered it to Irina Sergeyevna, and she looked through it with the focused attention of someone who already knew what they were looking for and was satisfied to find it there. "One more thing," she said. "The notary, Sokolov. He certified a document in which the signatory was provably not present. That is a criminal matter, not a civil one. I've spoken with a colleague in the prosecutor's office." It was the first time since the whole thing began that I felt something other than fear or anger. What I felt in that moment, sitting in Irina Sergeyevna's office with the late afternoon light coming through the Venetian blinds and laying pale stripes across the carpet, was something I can only describe as a door opening outward. The particular sensation of a situation that had felt sealed and airless suddenly having an exit. The confrontation I had been bracing for, the dramatic, explosive scene I had imagined and rehearsed in my head 100 times in the preceding weeks, did not happen the way I expected. It happened on a Saturday morning, 10 days after I had delivered my evidence, and it happened because Lyudmila called me and asked, with the same warm casualness she had always used, whether I was free that afternoon. She said she wanted to come by. She said she had something to discuss with me. She said it in a tone that told me, with perfect clarity, that she believed she was coming to deliver terms, that she thought the moment had arrived when she could lay the plan on the table and watch me understand that I had already lost. She arrived at 2 o'clock with Dmitri. I had asked my neighbor, a retired woman named Galina Petrovna, who had known my grandmother for 30 years, to be present. I told Galina Petrovna only that I needed a witness for a family conversation, and she had agreed without asking questions, because she was that kind of person and because she had, over the years, formed her own quiet opinions about Lyudmila's visits to the apartment. Lyudmila came in and looked around the apartment in her usual way, that slow, comprehensive survey. And then she sat down at the kitchen table and accepted the tea I offered and arranged her face into the expression she used when she was about to say something difficult for your own good. Dmitri sat beside her and did not look at me directly. He was wearing a new jacket. I noticed this and filed it away as the kind of detail that means nothing and everything. "I wanted to talk to you about the apartment," Lyudmila began. Her voice was gentle. I know this is difficult, and I want you to know that whatever happens, you're family, and we will always take care of you. But there are some legal matters that have come to light. Some issues with the original inheritance that I've been trying to protect you from, honestly, because I didn't want you to have to deal with the stress, and I think it's time we discuss them honestly as a family." I looked at her. I had rehearsed this moment too many times to feel anything but a kind of cold, focused attention, the way a surgeon must feel at the beginning of a procedure they have performed before. "What legal matters?" I said. She explained it to me, carefully and with apparent reluctance, as if each word cost her something. "There had been procedural errors in the filing of my grandmother's will," she said. "There was a question," she said, "about whether the will had been witnessed correctly. There was a possibility. She was so sorry to tell me this. She'd been dreading this conversation, that the inheritance might not be legally valid and that the apartment would need to be reassigned to the nearest living relatives, which, after my mother's death, would mean her. She said she had consulted a lawyer. She said the matter was already in process. She said she hoped we could resolve it quietly within the family, without a long and expensive court case that would be painful for everyone. I've already spoken to my lawyer," I said. Something shifted in her face. It was subtle. A fractional tightening around the eyes, a slight compression of the lips, a recalibration happening behind an expression that remained, on the surface, composed. Beside her, Dimitri's hands, which had been resting flat on the table, moved slightly. "Of course," she said. "Of course you've spoken to a lawyer. That's perfectly understandable. But I think once your lawyer reviews the documentation, you'll see that—" "My lawyer has already reviewed the documentation," I said. "She received copies of the deed of transfer and the rental agreement 2 weeks ago. She has also been in contact with the prosecutor's office regarding the notary who certified the transfer deed." The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. It was a silence with a shape to it, heavy and specific, a silence that was the sound of two people recalibrating, simultaneously, understanding that the room they had walked into was not the room they had prepared for. Lyudmila's face did not crumble. I want to be precise about this because it matters. It did not crumble. It rearranged. The warmth drained out of it slowly, like water from a basin, and what was left underneath was something harder and less apologetic, something that had been there all along behind the cakes from the bakery and the careful questions and the furrowed concern. "You don't understand what you're doing," she said. Her voice was still controlled, but the gentleness was entirely gone from it. "You're making this so much more difficult than it needs to be. We are your family. After everything I did for you when your mother died, after all the years I was there for you. You were the one who forged my signature on a property transfer document," I said. I kept my voice very quiet. I had discovered in the preceding weeks that quiet is more effective than volume, that a sentence spoken softly in a room that is gone still carries farther and lands harder than anything shouted. "You did it using a notary who is your son's brother-in-law. You did it on a date when I was provably in another city, and you had been planning it for at least 18 months before that." Dimitri stood up. He had been sitting in silence since they arrived, and he continued not to speak, but he stood, and the movement had the quality of a reflex, the instinctive physical response of someone who has been sitting in a room that has just become dangerous. Lyudmila looked at him, and something passed between them, a look, brief and freighted, and then she looked back at me. "I want you to leave," I said. "Both of you, and I want you to understand that the next conversation between us will take place in a courtroom." Lyudmila stood. She picked up her handbag from the back of the chair with the precise, unhurried movements of a woman who refuses, on principle, to be seen to hurry. She looked at me for a long moment, and the look she gave me was one I recognized. Had been seeing it, I realized, all my life, since I was a child who came to her apartment at New Year's and was given chocolates she knew I didn't like. It was the look of someone who had always considered me an inconvenience, a peripheral problem, a minor obstacle between herself and something she wanted. The look now contained something new, the specific cold fury of someone who has been caught. She left without speaking again. Dimitri followed her out without looking at me. I heard the front door close, not slammed, but closed with a deliberate final click. and then the sound of the elevator, and then silence. Galina Petrovna, who'd been sitting in the corner of the kitchen throughout the whole exchange with her hands folded and her face carefully neutral, let out a long, slow breath. "She was always like that," she said quietly, "even when your grandmother was alive. I never said anything because it wasn't my place, but she was always like that." The case moved through the system with the grinding, inexorable slowness of legal processes everywhere, but it moved. Irina Sergeyevna was methodical and thorough, and possessed of a patience I found both admirable and occasionally maddening. The evidence of forgery was unambiguous. My documented presence in Kazan on the date of the alleged signing was unchallengeable, and the involvement of Dmitri's brother-in-law in the notarization gave the prosecutor's office the grounds it needed to open a criminal investigation separate from the civil proceedings. Petr Viktorovich Sokolov, the notary, retained his own lawyer and initially denied everything. But when Irina Sergeyevna produced email correspondence between him and Dmitri discussing the logistics of the signing, obtained through a court order for his business records, his position became considerably less tenable. He agreed, in the end, to cooperate with the investigation in exchange for consideration in sentencing. His testimony detailed the entire sequence of events with a precision that confirmed everything Irina Sergeyevna had already established and added several things she hadn't known. The most significant of these was that this had not been the first time. Sokolov had worked with Dmitri on 2 previous transactions, both involving elderly property owners in the city, both resulting in fraudulent transfers, both currently under investigation by the time he gave his testimony. The machine Lyudmila and Dmitri had built was not a one-time improvisation. It was a practiced operation running for years, and my apartment had been the latest in a series. This was the detail that I sat with for the longest time after Irina Sergeyevna told me. The knowledge that what had happened to me had happened to others, to people who perhaps hadn't been as lucky, who hadn't had a colleague recommend a good lawyer, who hadn't kept their boarding passes from a February conference. I thought about those people often in the months that followed. The civil case was resolved first. The deed of transfer was declared invalid and struck from the registry. The attempted rental agreement was voided. My ownership of the apartment was formally reconfirmed with a notation in the registry that flagged any future transactions for additional verification. The criminal proceedings took considerably longer, running through the autumn and into the following winter. And when the verdict came, Dmitri received a suspended sentence and a substantial fine, and Sokolov lost his notarial license and received a conditional sentence. Lyudmila herself was not charged with the primary fraud. The prosecution was unable to establish her direct involvement in the forgery to the standard required for criminal conviction. She was, however, named in the civil judgment as a co-beneficiary of the fraudulent transaction and ordered to pay legal costs. It was not everything I had wanted. It was, Irina Sergeyevna told me quietly in the corridor outside the courtroom, more than most people in similar cases obtained. Uncle Gennady called me once, about 3 weeks after the confrontation in the kitchen. He was the only one of them who called. His voice was tired and sober and carried the flatness of a man who has understood something about his own life that he would have preferred not to understand. He said he had not known about the plan until it was already in motion, and that he was sorry, and that he understood if I never wanted to speak to any of them again. I thanked him and told him I appreciated the call. I did not tell him that it changed anything, because it didn't. The linden trees in the courtyard bloomed that June, the way they always did, and the sweetness came through the kitchen window in the evenings and filled the apartment the way it had filled it every summer since my grandmother had moved in 40-odd years ago. I sat at the round kitchen table, her table, my table now, with a cup of coffee and the last of the legal correspondence and the particular stillness of a person who has been running hard for a long time and has finally, carefully, stopped. I had lost something. I want to be honest about that because stories that end with nothing lost are not true stories. I had lost whatever remnant of family I had imagined I still possessed. I had lost the comfortable, self-protective belief that people who bring you cakes and ask about your health are acting from something other than calculation. I had lost a certain ease, the ease of not knowing what people are capable of, which is a specific kind of innocence that once it's gone does not come back. I did not mourn these things the way I had expected to. They had already been gone, in some sense, before I knew they were gone. What I was mourning was not what I had lost, but what had never existed in the first place. What I had kept was everything that mattered. The apartment, with its high ceilings and its clanking radiators, and its view of the courtyard where the linden trees were blooming. The knowledge that my grandmother had known, when she wrote her will, exactly what she was doing and exactly who she was giving her home to. The understanding, the hard, clear, permanent understanding, of my own capacity to act, to plan, to stand very still in a kitchen and speak quietly and not be moved. I had not known I possessed that capacity before any of this happened. I knew it now. The coffee cooled, the light went gold, the trees outside moved in the evening air with a sound like pages turning, like water, like the slow and patient passage of time. I sat at my grandmother's table in my apartment on my street and listened to them, and I thought, she knew. She always knew, and she left it to me anyway.